We at World GBC see standards such as these so important because they usually set a definition and they set a trajectory that sets the companies on a pathway to really reducing emissions. And so around the world we see that this can really spur leadership and a common definition that is adopted within the wider industry. We don't always see that maybe every company or every project will adopt the same standards, but once the leading projects adopt it, we see that it will filter down through the rest of the industry and the rest of infrastructure. We see them as really important. We have a number of schemes run by our green building councils around the world, and a number of them are focused on buildings, but a number of them also on infrastructure projects such as metros. Our India Green Building Council, for example, now rates metros, train stations, infrastructure projects like that, and are starting to incorporate not only the operating emissions of some of those projects, but also the life cycle and the embodied carbon that goes into their construction and production. So we're seeing this really starting to happen in more and more countries, and we're encouraging this to happen in even more. Well, significant. We just heard some new data that's going to be released by the International Energy Agency in the coming months, which says now that 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the building and construction sector. That has gone up from 30%, which is the figure that's been used in the past. And of those 40%, 10% come directly from construction, and that relates to infrastructure projects as well as buildings. So what we're seeing is this is significant. In order to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement, to get to 2 degrees of global warming, or even better, under 2 degrees of global warming, we really have to decarbonize by around 2050. And what that requires is full decarbonization of this sector, and it's a huge percent of emissions that have to be reduced. So our focus is increasingly on the construction and the infrastructure side. As we're learning a lot more about how to reduce operating emissions from building and infrastructure projects, the next focus really needs to be on the whole construction, the manufacturing process, the industrial processes that are behind the creation and construction of this infrastructure globally. We think it will have a huge impact. We're seeing increasingly companies starting to set science-based targets. And what those do is they take a look at the science and what the science tells us about the speed at which we have to decarbonize. And a science-based targets then looks at their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and starts to encourage those companies to set very specific targets within each scope. So what starts to happen is if every company across the whole value chain sets these science-based targets, they'll have to start working with one another to be able to achieve different components. So for example, if you're a developer, you're going to need a concrete company to reduce their emissions as you're going to be incorporating their materials in your development. And same with these massive infrastructure projects. If you're running an infrastructure project, you're going to need your whole supply chain to reduce their emissions and their embodied carbon within their own manufacturing processes, because those will have an impact on the embodied carbon of your own project. So with the increase in these science-based targets and the way that they're all interrelated, it forces a positive collaboration because every action taken by one industry actor affects another. We're seeing the role of cities is huge. There's so many more of the population. We're saying 2/3 of the population will live in cities in the years to come. The rate of construction and growth and development in many of these cities, particularly in the global south and places like China, are huge. They say in China they build the equivalent of Rome every 3 weeks. So the scale of this is just enormous. And so to really change and reduce the emissions from the infrastructure sector, we have to work with cities and through cities and with city mayors, because that's where the change is happening. And we're seeing that globally, I think even 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from concrete. And if these cities are growing at the same pace they're growing at now, this will lead to a huge demand and increase of concrete to build the new homes, the infrastructure needed for the future. So we need to work with city mayors to also make commitments at the city level to work with their industry to drive down these emissions in the future.